Welcome everyone to CGTN's special series, Looking Ahead, in our special coverage of the World Economic Forum's 2023 annual meeting. I'm Michael Wang here in our virtual Davos studio in Beijing. Well, leaders and thought leaders from around the world have gathered in Davos, Switzerland for the 5-day event, which begins today. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He will attend Davos 2023 and give a special address on January 17th at 10:45 GMT or 18:45 China Standard Time. Now, that special address will be live streamed by the World Economic Forum. In our live stream right now, though, we want to get the conversation started on Davos 2023. The theme of this year's annual meeting is cooperation in a fragmented world. Our first guest today is an icon in the world of advertising and marketing. Sir Martin Sorrell joins us live. Sir Martin formerly founded what turned out to be, of course, the world's largest advertising company, WPP. He embarked on a new journey in 2018 and founded a technology-led next-gen digital ad and marketing services company called S4 Capital. Sir Martin, welcome to the program. I think it is a cool and brisk -6 degrees where you are. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Yes, well, thank you, Michael. I've been sitting here for a few minutes, so I'm suitably frozen already, but let's get into it.
Yeah, let's get into it. It's a little bit warmer here in Beijing, about 0 degrees. So Martin, I want to ask you about your World Economic Forum session that you will be speaking and participating in. It's called AI and White-Collar Jobs. Now, in previous industrial revolutions, we saw the automation of physical manual labor, and now we're talking about the automation of the cognitive, automation of perhaps the mind. So how disruptive do you think artificial intelligence, big data, and machine learning will be for knowledge workers?
Well, I think that it's a matter of great debate, and in our session on Friday, no doubt we will get stuck into it. And I think it's one of the big issues that are being debated here in Davos this year. I suppose the top of mind is inflation and the world economy. Secondly, I guess, fragmentation and maybe deglobalization or a change in the geographical landscape, which is, of course, very important in the context of China. And the third issue, I think, is around crypto and AI. And I think the answer to your question, Michael, depends on how rapidly artificial intelligence becomes artificial general intelligence. I think the conventional wisdom is that machines will reduce the tedium or replace blue-collar jobs. My own view is it's going to have a very significant impact, not just on the menial, the repetitive jobs, but increasingly on the over time. And it will take time, because machines will have to get used to it and have to be trained for it. But I think in time, machines will attack, if I can put it that way, not just blue collar, as it's called, but white collar as well. So I think there's going to be a very fundamental change, just like we've seen in digital communications, the digital economy overtake the analog economy, traditional newspapers, television, radio, cinema, etc. I think the same thing will happen in artificial intelligence, or maybe we should describe it as artificial general intelligence, because the focus at the moment is on the tedious and the repetitive, and I think the real focus should be on bigger things and general intelligence. So it will take time, but it will get there. And China, of course, will play a very big part of that. Both the US and China probably will be leaders in that area of technology as it develops over the coming years.
Yeah. Well, Sir Martin, some people don't expect we will get to artificial general intelligence. Some predict we might get there within a decade's time. But if and once we do get there, what do you think AGI will mean in terms of complementing workers and actually substituting them? So there is a debate in terms of whether or not AI will make us more efficient, but also a debate about whether or not they will just take away our jobs completely. Where do you stand on this debate? Will AGI or AI in general better complement our working skills down the road or really substitute us in the future? Because right now, Sir Martin, I'm not sure if you're aware, there are already virtual TV anchors here in China.
Well, there has been virtual design. I mean, there was a Russian designer, I think about a year or so ago in our industry, who established supposed to be a human, who established the design style. And after about 12 months, after several agencies tried to copy that style, found out it was actually a robot and it was artificial intelligence. I think the answer to your question, Michael, my own view would be, as I said in answer to your first question, is that the conventional wisdom is that the machines will replace blue-collar or menial tasks. I think over time, and it will, you said 10 years, that might be the right time frame. It might be even longer. But I think over time, much more significant jobs will be replaced by machines. So I think we will be faced with issues around employment and the replacement of jobs by artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence.
And when we do get to artificial general intelligence, Sir Martin, do you think AGI can actually automate creativity as well? Because it's one thing in terms of automating certain white-collar skills, but creativity always seems like the purview of mankind. Can we actually automate creativity down the road, you think?
Well, obviously I'm biased and subjective about it, Michael, and I liken it to what's happened with data. A lot of people in our industry, I think including in China, but certainly in the West, have said that data destroys creativity, that numbers and maths destroy it. I think it informs creativity. I think the answer to your question on creativity is that I think AI or AGI, general intelligence, will complement and improve creativity and provide alternative means and ways of getting to solutions. So my own view is it will be complement, but over time we'll have to see how it develops. There are people who believe that it will, just like that design example that I gave you, which surprised people after a period of 12 months, they believe that over time machines will replace people. We have to see how it pans out.
Yeah. And what's your take, Sir Martin, on how we can better bridge the digital divide between tech-rich companies and tech-rich economies and tech-poor companies and economies? Because right now it seems like certain economies and societies have more access to big data, have more access to technology. How do we really bridge that digital divide?
Well, it's a difficult problem, and the two leaders in technology, the US and China, both have a role in their initiatives, in their use of soft power around the world, to ensure that that digital divide, that chasm between developed countries or the more mature economies and the growing or the immature economies, that gap is reduced. So I see the US and to some extent Western Europe, but less so, and I see China with the development of Alipay and AliCloud and similar technologies as being in a position to reduce that digital divide and to make it easier for the disadvantaged economies to bridge that gap. But it's a responsibility of the developed nations, and particularly the developed technological nations, to embrace that challenge. It's the same as we see in a number of other areas in the environment, in social areas and governmental areas. I think the role of both countries is going to be critically important. We'll get into the cooperation or lack of cooperation between the US and China, no doubt, further on in this interview. But I think it is a responsibility of both countries to see that divide is bridged. Otherwise, that gap will widen, and that will be to the detriment of everybody.
Right. So how difficult do you think that challenge may be, Sir Martin, in terms of bridging the digital divide? Because when you have the data, it's easier, and then you get into a virtuous cycle when it comes to scaling technologies and commercializing it. But right now, like you said, there might be some geopolitical tensions. The data haves and the data have-nots. It seems like it's widening. So how big of a problem is this? Because if we don't close that gap, that could have huge developmental implications and potentially social stability implications in many lower income economies around the world.
Well, I think both of those countries, the US and China, which today are the number 1 and 2 economies in the world, and no doubt in time China will be the largest economy, maybe not on a per capita basis, but certainly on an absolute basis. I think it's the role and responsibility of both economies, maybe in partnership. My own view would be, my own wish would be that they would do it in partnership together, or increasingly in partnership. But it will be a role and responsibility for both countries and both economies, along with other countries in the West, such as my own in the UK and Germany and France and Italy and Spain and others, to ensure that that digital divide is bridged. So, as I say, it's part of the purpose of governments. I use the term soft power. It's a way of deploying soft power through technology, and that will enable people to accelerate their growth and development. So it's a responsibility, I think, for us all.
Gotcha. So Martin, I want to get your take on the state of the global economy as you see it, because we are predicting the world economy to slow down in this year. We are expecting perhaps a mild recession or maybe a stronger recession. We don't know yet in many of the world's advanced economies. But are there highlights that you see in terms of what we can expect for the global economy in 2023?
Well, we're certainly going to see slower growth. I mean, this time last year, Michael, we were thinking that 2022 would be what? 3.5%, 4%, maybe even more. 4.5% was being talked about as we went into 2022. And look at the result. We probably ended up somewhere around 2-3% with inflation, with interest rates, with the war in Ukraine, and with the other challenges that we've had around COVID and the aftermath, and as in the case of China, the continuing fight against COVID. So that has reduced expectations for this year. The interest rate actions that the central banks have taken in the West, in most countries, I think really is starting to get inflation under control. It is sort of interesting that people are starting to worry now that we may see inflation creeping up. We may see a pivot from the Fed towards, or other central banks, towards the middle or second half of the year, and that economies might be stimulated again and inflation might creep up again. Certainly we're starting to hear that drumbeat. My own view is that we will see soft landings in most of the Western economies, but I think the critical issue, Michael, is that the world has changed and has become, as the title of the Davos conference this year talks about, a more fragmented economy. And therefore, I think global companies such as our own, we're a mini global company, a company that's expanding its footprint around the world, has to be much more selective in its geographical deployment. Over the last 40 or 50 years, it didn't matter where you went, wherever you planted your flag, as long as the demographics were good, you succeeded. Today is very, very different. I think North and South America offer a lot of opportunity. I think the Middle East, with higher energy prices and a higher inflation, I think inflation will not revert to the 2% that central banks talk about. I think the new 2% will be 3% or something around that. We will have to become accustomed to a higher rate of inflation and higher energy prices. So the Middle East will continue to prosper. Africa, I think, will remain volatile. And Asia will be a source of great growth, with the one caveat around relationships between US and China. I think if relationships improve, I think the position for China and Asia will be even stronger. But on the assumption that they don't, and that we have a continuing lack of cooperation, Asia will still be very important, but the balances in Asia are going to shift. The Chinese economy will always be strong, but other economies such as Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Singapore will become increasingly important as long as that political tension and uncertainty remains. So the balance will shift, as I say, I think in the world economy to North and South America, the Middle East, and Asia. And the problems, I think, will focus more and more around Europe, where the prospects for France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and indeed the UK are not as good as they have been historically, and I think will continue to be challenged. In the UK, we're facing a very difficult 2023. The back end of 22 was difficult with political changes, and I think it's a similar position with the continuing war in Ukraine and the continued security risk on the assumption the war doesn't end soon, which I think is the most likely scenario. I think the economic picture for Europe is not good. But as I say, companies such as our own are going to have to be increasingly highly selective about what they do. The other area of interesting expansion is digital transformation. Companies are not only looking to expand their volumes and revenues, and therefore digital advertising and marketing becoming increasingly important, but also digital transformation to try and reduce cost is also going to be important. So those two features, a selective geographical approach and a focus on revenue growth and activation and performance and cost reduction, are the two, I think, features principally of 2023 and indeed beyond in 24 and even beyond that.
Yeah. So, Sir Martin, then I want to ask you whether or not you think the changes that we see in the world right now, is that going to be the new normal? It seems like we went from a low for long environment where we had low interest rates, relatively low volatility, more predictability, and it seems like quite a sudden reversal in the past few years into one that's a world that's more complex, more volatile, and we're doing that at speed. And we're also at a higher inflation environment. Inflation may have eased, but interest rates most likely are going to stay elevated for a longer period of time. Are the good old days, you think, gone?
Yes, I think that is the case. I agree with that. Whether it's deglobalization, fragmentation, however you term it, I think basically the game has shifted, and the pieces on the chessboard are in very different positions today than they were even a year or 2 years ago. And that era of free trade or relatively free trade, reduction in tariffs, and global development, which really started in the 1980s, into the 90s and into the new millennium, has now been checked as we go into the third decade of this millennium. And I think your description is valid. I think we're going to have to be much more selective, much more digitally focused, and much more attuned to volatility. So agility is the key corporate attribute. I know a lot of CEOs at Davos and elsewhere talk about their organizations being agile and responsive, and often that might be the case, but often it's not the case. And I think agility, reduction of bureaucracy, responding. Ironically, in COVID, what we saw was a push down of authority and responsibility to regional management and country management, and that has devolved responsibility, which I think has actually been quite good in terms of stimulating agility inside corporations. Whether that retrenches or not, we will have to see. But agility is going to be really, really important, particularly in a world, going back to the AI questions that you posed, where technology is changing the game very rapidly and causing companies to look at things very differently. You've only got to look at the volatility. I think the average life of a CEO in the FTSE 100 is about 5 years now. And the average life of a CMO, a chief marketing officer in most multinational corporations, probably about 2 to 3 years. So the volatility is huge, and I think you're absolutely right that conditions have changed and companies are going, that will make companies much more short-term in their thinking. It's going to make them focus much more on performance and activation, moving down the funnel, as we call it in the marketing world, to focus on performance and activation, on ROI, on data and analytics, and on media mix. These are the issues in the marketing world that are going to become much more important in the coming years.
Right. So it may seem indeed like a more fragmented world these days, Sir Martin, but I don't think our international community have to sleepwalk into the fate of a more fragmented world with higher tensions and more complexity. What about cooperation then? I mean, cooperation is not as sensationalist as some of the maybe other headline-grabbing news events that we see on social media, etc. But cooperation, I think, is the most practical way forward. And here in China, we always talk about win-win cooperation and how we can strengthen cooperation. We know, of course, the relationship between the world's two largest economies is absolutely crucial for cooperation going forward. But what else can we do to really strengthen cooperation in these uncertain times? Let's not just throw away cooperation. Let's still try and find ways and try and find solutions to boost cooperation.
Well, I think you touched on the most important issue, which is relationships between the US government and China. Maybe we started to see in the last few days maybe a little bit of a shift in China's approach. We haven't seen a shift, I'm sad to say, in the US's approach as yet. It's a bipartisan approach of both Republican and Democratic parties. And I think there's no getting away from it. That is the main focus that we have to focus on, Michael, is no other real solution when the two largest economies in the world, what we're talking about a world that is about $90 trillion, about $95 trillion. The US is about 25 trillion, China about 15. So almost getting on for a third, half of the world economy is in these two countries, and they dominate the world's economy. India is coming up fast, and maybe over the coming years, Indonesia will be in the top 5. But for the next foreseeable future, relationships between those two countries are absolutely critical. We do have a Chinese presence here at Davos, but it's not as big a presence as in previous years, which I think is to be regretted. But dialogue between the two major powers in the world is absolutely critical. And as I say, I think we saw an interesting, maybe a little shift recently as President Xi starts to focus after Party Congress ratifying his continuation, the reduction of COVID and withdrawal from COVID, stimulation of the Chinese economy, a focus on the real estate market, youth unemployment, the low growth in the Chinese economy, the need for the urban economy to be stimulated to absorb rural labor. That all plays into a stronger Chinese economy, and that might augur well for more cooperation. But I worry about the gap between the US and China, and I don't think there are any alternatives to sealing that gap or reducing that gap. Other countries can aid and abet and encourage cooperation, but it really is up to the administrations of both those countries to get together for the benefit of all.
Can I quickly follow up on that, Sir Martin? Because we know, of course, there are differences between China and the United States. I think China and the United States both recognize their differences, but it seems like China is trying to find solutions to indeed find ways to cooperate with the United States. But because of perhaps the social media environment in the US and echo chambers, it seems like it's hard to find a solution there.
Well, I think to be fair, it's been on both sides. I think there have been some interesting changes in the Chinese government, in the foreign ministry in recent days, and that might signal a change in the Chinese approach, in President Xi's approach. We haven't as yet seen a signal. I was in Washington recently, and we were talking about whether there would be a change in approach. We're looking forward to what may happen in 2024. If there was a Republican administration, I think it's probably unlikely that we would see a softening of the U.S. approach. Maybe if there was a continuation of Democratic administration, might be more likely slightly, but probably not so, because, as I say, it's a bipartisan approach. At the moment, I have to say, Michael, I see it as being somewhat intractable. I know the hope of some major U.S. global companies is that the need for trade and for commercial development is so strong on both sides that will drive cooperation. But I have my doubts. And until there's a more fundamental change in approach at governmental level on both sides, I don't think you're going to see significant changes. And I really do worry about it. Really, it's top of my concerns. I think if you're running a global company and you have a big position in China, and particularly if you're a U.S. company, the pressures that are being put you're being put under are very significant. So I think it is a high level of concern.
Gotcha. Well, nonetheless, I mean, the massive scale of the Chinese economy could, though, still provide that platform for cooperation between the two countries. I know, indeed, it will promote cooperation between the two countries. So let me turn to the Chinese economy now, Sir Martin, and talk about the digital economy here in China, and get your outlook on the development potential of China's digital economy. Back in 2021, China's digital economy came in at about 40% of the country's economic output, at nearly 6.8 trillion US dollars, the second largest in the world. What's your take on the future of digital here in China?
Well, it will continue to grow at a rate. I mean, for reasons we've already touched on, whether it be AI or continued growth of digital transformation, as I've touched on in the context of the world economy. And I think we've seen some interesting moves recently with a freeing up of the restrictions on Chinese tech companies, the evolution of the golden share, not just in the case of ByteDance, but maybe Alibaba and Tencent. That seems to have signaled now a change in direction by President Xi's administration to allow further growth in the digital economy and the big Chinese tech companies. And what I think we're witnessing is now another leg up in the digital economy. So if the Chinese digital ecosystem was 40% of the economy, it's going to be significantly greater over the coming years. In the West, we're certainly seeing digital advertising 60%, 65%. It'll be 75% of total advertising by 2025. And I think the same thing will happen in China. And I think it's probably a perverse thing to highlight in a way, but what we've seen with the war in Ukraine is the importance of cyber, not just in terms of defense, but offense too. And I think governments now realize, when they look at what's been happening in the Ukraine, as to how important a strong technological base to the economy is, and how no economy can afford to hobble the growth of technological development. So good changes, I think, and I think the party and the government, the Chinese government, have now sort of sorted out the structure, that golden share structure that will enable, and we've seen a very significant change in the outlook for Chinese tech companies in terms of market valuations. I mean, a number of them have doubled in value in the last 3 or 4 months. So I think that augurs well for the growth and development of the digital economy in China, on the back of what I suppose we'll get into in a second. I'm very bullish on the growth of the Chinese economy as we go into 23 and beyond.
Yeah, we'll touch upon that in just a second. But Sir Martin, I just want to clarify to our viewers, China's policy was never about stunting the growth of its internet companies and its platform economy. I think the direction there was to promote the healthy development of the internet sector. So Chinese policymakers gave a relatively free hand for tech companies here in China to experiment and trial with new business models for their products and services. But I think the policy here is about healthy development of the entire sector, making sure that there are not that many anti-competitive practices going on in the platform economy and the internet sector, making sure everybody's data is protected as well. Let me turn to the Chinese economy now and get your take on your outlook for 2023 and especially China's consumer market, because right now China has the largest middle income group in the entire world at 400 million plus strong. And the goal is to double that to about 800 million people or over 800 million people in 15 years' time. So give us your take on the Chinese economy this year and your outlook for China's domestic demand, its consumer market down the road.
Well, I think we've seen a significant change in the last few months. Obviously, 2022, I think it's tomorrow we will learn what the growth in the Chinese economy was in 2022, and it wasn't as significant as we thought at the beginning of the year. But the prognosis for 2023 that I look at, for example, looking at the Western investment banks like Goldman Sachs, they're talking about 5% growth in the Chinese economy in 2023. Now, the relaxation of the rules around COVID probably mean that Q1 will be slow growth. So I think we will see a very strong reaction in terms of travel and consumption starting in Q2. I've seen some forecasts for Q2 of 13% in terms of GDP growth. And if Q1 is flat or flattish and Q2 starts to grow, to get to 5% for the year, you're going to have to see very significant growth in Q2, Q3, and Q4, and I think that will be the case. So I am very bullish about the changes that are starting to take place around travel, not just domestically in China, but externally. The relaxation of the rules around COVID, the stimulation of vaccination, and I hope that will spread amongst the older age groups where it needs to be. And so I'm very bullish on the economy in 23 and going into 24. And I think the catalyst for that was the party congress and the confirmation of President Xi for his latest term.
Let me talk about what businesses can do, Sir Martin, in terms of succeeding here in the massive China market.
Sure.
This is a fast evolving market. So when brands look at the different demographics and different segments here in China, what do you think they need to do?
Well, I think it's China for China. And I think foreign multinationals have got to learn a few things. Firstly, I think in China, unlike the rest of the world economy, where there is a focus on moving down the funnel, for activation and performance, in China, brand is going to be critically important. China tends to have, it's the breadbasket of manufacturing in the world, and therefore it's very easy to reproduce in China products and services extremely quickly with great agility. And I think the key thing is for companies to focus on brands, if I can put it that way. I think what we're seeing is Chinese companies are investing quite heavily in brand to differentiate against more commodified categories and products and services. And I think foreign multinationals have to learn that. So whilst Chinese competition, I think the Chinese consumer has become more nationalistic and more focused on China products, all is not lost if foreign MNCs, multinational corporations, focus on Chinese brands, and then secondly, really develop a fundamental understanding of Chinese culture and deploy that aggressively in developing their brands in China. So I think those two things are critically important to focus on brand building. It goes against some of the things that we're seeing in the West, where consumers are trading down and are becoming more price conscious, and savings that accumulated over COVID have been depleted. So I think brands, paradoxically, in relation to what's happening in the West, are becoming more and more important in China because it's so easy to reproduce things in a strong manufacturing base. But in addition to that, I think foreign multinationals, as long as they're willing to spend a significant time understanding Chinese culture and the Chinese consumer, and the Chinese consumer's focus on their Chinese heritage and Chinese approach, as long as they're prepared to do that, I think they can be very successful in the Chinese market. But they need to deploy in very different ways.
Yeah, and the Chinese consumer is increasingly savvy these days. I think Chinese brands offer that quality, that experience as well, and a lot of them offer quality and value for money at the same time. Final question to you, Sir Martin. I want to ask you about what brands can do these days to better engage and perhaps retain the consumer, because we have very short attention spans these days. We have endless choices right at the click of our fingertips. What can brands better do to engage with the modern day consumer?
Well, there are new technologies. I mean, Web 3.0, virtualization, the metaverse, as we call it. All these things are becoming much more engaging. And you're absolutely right, Michael. I mean, consumers are becoming more brand promiscuous. They're switching far faster. The number of messages they have to deal with in a digital environment, the number is huge. And therefore, their attention spans, as you mentioned, have shortened. And that's why digital has become so powerful. I mean, for example, we in the West, I remember Facebook came out with the insight that women in Italy, it was, spent 1.7 seconds on a post. And our people in Italy, it was work for L'Oreal, came out with ads that were 2-second ads. So the answer to your question is you have to exploit the insight by using not TV commercials for 60 seconds that take a long time to produce. So by the time you produce them, the problem has changed, but coming out with instantaneous, agile solutions. At the same time, the technology is developing in such a sophisticated way. I mean, we can produce a global campaign out of our studios anywhere in the world now within a week, anywhere in the world. So the technology is much more rapid and can be deployed much more rapidly. But virtualization demands emotional intelligence as well. It's a bit like your question to me about artificial intelligence and creative. It may well be that AI stimulates creativity just like data has, and in the world of an increasingly sophisticated digital world, virtual world, we will have to establish even stronger emotional connections with the consumers to make sure that we establish that brand connection. And I think in the Chinese market, that is going to be increasingly important. Brands will be more important, understanding of local culture and the reasons why Chinese consumers are so focused on China's brands will be equally important, but also an emotional connection will remain important whatever the technology is that you use.
Yeah, and perhaps establish that emotional connection quite quickly. Wow, 1.7 seconds, 2 seconds, that's quite fast. I mean, one statistic I saw was that the average consumer had an attention span of 8 seconds, but I mean, 1.7 to 2 seconds, that just knocks that out of the park. Sir Martin, we're going to leave it there. Really appreciate your insights, and thank you for joining us in Davos, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon right here in Beijing. Thank you, Sir Martin.
Thank you, Michael. Look forward to seeing you in Beijing. Thank you very much.
Great. Bye-bye. And that was Sir Martin Sorrell, founder and executive chairman of S4 Capital. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll turn our focus to global trade. Now, open markets and trade have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, created hundreds of millions of jobs that come with higher wages as well. But with the future of globalization under pressure from the forces of protectionism, will global trade as we know it today be fundamentally changed or reimagined? We'll explore that and more with Sean Doherty, head of international trade and investment at the World Economic Forum, in just a moment.
.360-degree profiles of industry movers and shakers, tech mavericks, and policymakers. We drill down on their success. We ask how they set strategy and how they navigate in an increasingly competitive market. Real talk, real business. Join the conversation. Biz Talk, only on CGTN.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN. Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
And welcome back, everyone, to our snuggly virtual Davos studios here in Beijing. Our next guest is a member of the Executive Committee of the World Economic Forum. Sean Doherty is head of international trade and investment at the forum and joins us now to talk about the future of global trade. Sean, welcome to the program and thanks for joining us.
Hello, Michael. Pleasure to be talking to you from snowy Davos.
Yeah, Sean, you know, when we take a look back 4 years ago pre-pandemic, I think it's a very stark comparison because the theme for that year was all about globalization 4.0. And fast forward 4 years later, and the forum is talking about how do we find more cooperation in a more fragmented world. So Sean, I want to get your take first on the theme of this year's annual meeting. I mean, how fragmented is the world from the forum's perspective?
Well, indeed, trade growth has slowed, and it's diminished as a percentage of global GDP. Nonetheless, we have to remember, in absolute terms, trade is still at record highs, and that's true for most of the major trade lanes, both in import and export directions. Now, one important milestone we've seen recently, of course, is the reopening of China to travel, and that's extremely important. We're, very pleased that here in Davos we have a number of Chinese participants here to talk with us about trade, engaging in trade. Now, of course, geopolitical tensions, new forms of industrial policy, the coping with the environmental transition, all of these have created frictions in international trade and investment. But at the same time, we need that trade and investment in order to limit the downside from the potential coming economic slowdown. And so here in Davos, what we'll be trying to do is help people to work together. In the first instance, by looking at how to harness the power of government intervention without having harmful economic spillovers internationally. We'll be looking at how we can introduce new technology to make trade easier, particularly for developing nations and for smaller businesses. We'll be looking at how to improve the contribution of trade and investment to climate action. And very importantly, we hope to ensure that the benefits of trade and investment flow globally, including to disadvantaged communities.
Right. So, Sean, there are about 8 sessions related to trade at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting this year. There might be more sessions indirectly related to trade. But 2 questions I found interesting that the forum asks this year is, can trade actually be revitalized, and can new narratives be found when it comes to global trade? What are your thoughts on this? Because you're also going to be making some remarks at a session called Making the Case for Trade. So if you could give our viewers maybe a sneak preview of that session and help our viewers make the case for trade.
They're saying that 63% of the new wealth.
Absolutely. So yeah, there'll be well over 20 sessions focused on trade at this annual meeting. We'll have over 30 trade ministers participating, of course, with the scores of business participants. Now, in terms of making the case for trade, I think one of the things which is important is to understand and engage with the valid criticisms of trade. For example, trade has led to disruptions. We have seen increases in inequality within nations. There, of course, are still possibilities for environmental arbitrage across countries, and we have seen international tax evasion. But the important thing is that there are ways to tackle all of these problems, and indeed that is what the international community has been working on. Now, one of the emerging views which has come out of COVID and the current geopolitical tensions is that one way that nations can become more resilient is to withdraw from trade. Now, my view is that actually a more successful approach is to work on the diversity of trade and make sure that as a country you have a diverse set of economic relationships. As a business, you have a diverse web of suppliers around the world. We are now able to do that in a way that we weren't before. With new technologies, we can manage more dynamic supply chains. Global development has meant that there are now more countries we can source for. And this provides a tremendous opportunity for the Global South to engage more fully in global trade, both as producers and consumers.
Okay. Wow, there are some 20 sessions related to global trade. I counted 8, so I need to adjust, I think, my filters on the World Economic Forum's website. So really good to hear that there are around 20 sessions related to global trade. You mentioned the diversity of perhaps trading relationships, Sean. Does that also mean we're going to see still very long supply chains in the world? Or are you expecting the days of really long and extended supply chains to be over and we're going to see more regionalization of supply chains? Or can we have both extended but also regional as well?
Well, I think it's always been very important for businesses to be resilient and agile in their supply chains. I think Martin was just talking about that a moment ago. And as I mentioned, what we are seeing nowadays is that there is much greater potential for companies to have these more dynamic supply chains because they can manage the complexity, because they have now more options for where they source from. One of the important consequences of this is that some of the, I would say, frictional costs to trade, the costs which businesses pay in getting goods through customs or in setting up branch offices, dealing with the administrative costs of trade, these have become much more important in the choices businesses make about where they source from, where they invest. And as a result, countries have been focusing a lot more on trade and investment facilitation. That is, dealing with these non-intentional, shall we say, costs to trade, because they realize that if they wish to be competitive as a country or as a region, then they really need to bring down these costs so that businesses will be able to source from there, invest there, as they now have much greater optionality in how they build their supply chains.
And Sean, what do you see as the relationship between international trade and tackling climate change? So can trade policy actually lead to strengthening our efforts to battle climate change? I mean, trade obviously will produce greenhouse gas emissions, but can it also spur our international community's green transition?
Absolutely. I mean, trade is vital for spreading the green technologies which we need to decarbonize our economies and societies, and for sharing those best practices for how we gain energy efficiency. But it's also important that trade is not used as an excuse for climate inaction, or indeed that climate action is not used as an excuse for protectionism. This is one of the reasons why it's important that both trade and environmental policy aim to be as clear, as transparent, as neutral as possible. If we look at emissions trading systems, which are obviously one attempt to reach that goal, it's important to try and see how we can link those together. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is being introduced by the European Union, for instance, is one stepping stone towards that vision. And I think it's important to recognize that, important though such schemes may be directly, particularly in certain sectors, perhaps they're even more important in terms of the political space they provide for much stronger domestic action on climate change. And one further point I would make regarding trade and environmental policy is we need to look beyond climate change as well. If we just take the example of waste management, we can see that there's a need for strong cooperation between trade and environmental policymakers to avoid waste dumping, while at the same time making sure that we are able to have strong international circular economies, so that we are able to recycle our products across borders, dispose of them in the best way possible, and really make best use of the resources we employ.
Got it. Sean, what's your view on how the public sector and the private sectors can better work together to help our international community ensure the benefits of global trade, especially in an era where it seems like security is becoming more and more of a concern?
Well, I think one of the legitimate concerns which countries have had is that of overconcentration. And so I think it's very sensible for governments and businesses to talk together about how they can diversify their sourcing, diversify economic relationships. One other area where I think there is space for very constructive conversation between public and private sector, and of course internationally, is about how trade tools may be used in the future, hopefully in a very transparent way, in perhaps more of a doctrine for handling the escalation and then importantly de-escalation of trade in national security disputes.
And finally, Sean, I want to get your take on technology's potential impact on trade, because perhaps many lower income economies are still depending on that labor cost comparative advantage going down the road when it comes to development. but potentially technology can automate a lot of the lower paying jobs away, and technology perhaps can also mass produce many of the products that we need today as well. So how big of a risk do you think this is in terms of technology automating jobs away, mass producing products at scale, and taking away that low cost comparative advantage for many economies that still need to move up the value chain?
Well, I think it's a big challenge. I mean, automation is a challenge for all economies, and it's not just a challenge in the manufacturing sector, it's a challenge in services, because, you know, automation and technology does lead to disruption. You know, what we have to hope is that the benefits we gain from technology adoption are sufficient that we can overcome the downsides. But of course, we do have to remember that the adjustment can be extremely painful, and it can take a long time. And so what we need to do is make sure that we have strong adjustment assistance, strong social security nets, and indeed international solidarity.
Okay, and on that note of international solidarity, Sean, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks for your insights and thoughts on that. And that was Sean Doherty, head of trade and investment at the World Economic Forum. Up next, she's a globe-trotting jet-setter. From her base in Europe, Martina Fuchs, international TV anchor and business journalist, travels and reports from all corners of the world, working to connect the dots in our fast-changing world. We'll get Martina's take on this year's gathering of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting when we return.
.360-degree profiles of industry movers and shakers, tech mavericks, and policymakers. We drill down on their success. We ask how they set strategy and how they navigate in an increasingly competitive market. Real talk, real business. Join the conversation. Biz Talk, only on CGTN.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN. Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
And welcome back, everyone, to our virtual Davos studio here in Beijing. Our next guest calls the world her home. Constantly on the road, in the skies, and on the seas, Martina Fuchs is an international TV anchor and business journalist who has covered multiple World Economic Forum annual meetings. She joins us now with her thoughts on this year's gathering. Martina, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you again. Perhaps give our audience a sense first of how many World Economic Forum annual meetings you've actually been to, and what are your expectations for this year's meeting?
Michael, it's great to see you again, and hardly ever has it been so cold. It's minus 6 degrees as we speak, around noon local time here in Switzerland. I believe this is about my 8th edition now. I have covered the World Economic Forum here in Davos, in the highest town of Europe, a few times for CGTN, for you as well at the moment for another news outlet. But I must say it is still very exciting to come here. About 2,500 participants from all around the world will join us from about 130 countries, 52 heads of state and leaders from governments, as well as the biggest ever business representation. There will be some 600 top CEOs and 700 organizations. So I'm still as interested and as excited as it was my first World Economic Forum.
Yeah. Well, Martina, you mentioned it's minus 6 degrees in Davos right now. I mean, I guess because you are Swiss, therefore you are immune to the cold, I'm assuming. Where's the down jacket, Martina?
It's right here. Can you see it?
I can
I'm
see
wearing a down jacket as well as moon boots. And we have ice and snow spikes as well, so absolutely covered. But you know, as a global citizen, I'm still Swiss at heart, so I'm used to this cold weather and temperature. But I must say, I'll be also happy to travel to Senegal in February to continue my global travels as a world citizen.
Yeah, I wish I could weather the cold as well as you, Martina. So there are nearly 360 sessions at this year's annual meeting. Which topics and sessions are you most interested in?
There are going to be dozens of sessions and, of course, way too many to cover. I tell the organizers every year that they should really prolong the WEF, have it 1 week, 2 weeks. This would also boost the local economy, give more accommodation to the people, have hotels really renting out the rooms, give restaurants more business opportunities as well. There will be lots of sessions focusing on climate change and sustainability, focusing on the war in Ukraine and what the world can do, the Chinese economy as well, and the next chapter after the 20th Party Congress last year. There will be a lot of AI, cryptocurrency discussions, and of course also other ways to help protect the environment, such as ending the plastic waste. Tomorrow, of course, it's the real kickoff of the World Economic Forum with the keynote address by the Swiss President Alain Berset, together with the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, and then followed at 11:15 local time by Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission.
Well, Martina, you truly are a global citizen because in the past year or maybe past 2 years, you've pretty much hit all the continents on the planet. And I really want to get that international perspective from you in terms of how you see cooperation in what seems like a more fragmented world these days.
It's all about the public-private partnerships, and this is also the key message that the WEF wants to send this year. We need to come together. In 2017, I remember very vividly the speech of the Chinese President Xi Jinping when he was calling for multilateralism, really getting everybody work together, because COVID-19, the pandemic, should have shown that we all sit in the same boat, that we need to work together. All the countries in the world, all the people, all the cultures. And as you know, Michael, international communication has always been one of my goals, really bridging East and West and all the different parts of the world, all the different continents. Now, we have seen from the WEF Global Risks Report, which was released last week, that the cost of living crisis is at the top of the agenda and the biggest risk for the next 2 years. We have also seen that the failure to adapt to climate change and mitigate climate change is one of the biggest risks for the next 10 years. And these are clearly poly-crises, together with, of course, the economic crisis, food crisis, energy crisis, high interest rates, high inflation, that we all need to tackle together as global citizens as well. And we need governments and businesses working together, so really this multi-stakeholder approach.
Yeah, well, Martina, you mentioned the WEF's global risks reporting. You were speaking actually to the forum's managing director, Sadia Zahidi, recently. And like you mentioned, the cost of living crisis was identified by the forum as not only this year's, but also next year's top risk as well. So in your international travels, did you see that cost of living crisis really coming up? Because we are facing a very high inflationary environment in many parts of the world. And maybe give us some of your reflections in your conversation with Sadia.
Absolutely. So from a very personal perspective, I split my time between London and Zurich. I have two homes, and in London especially, the crime rate is spiking. It's really sometimes dangerous to walk around in certain neighborhoods. People are struggling for food. I have heard from Uber delivery people that sometimes their food that they have to deliver from door to door gets stolen. So this crisis is real. I will travel in a couple of days to Senegal, West Africa, and I'm sure that a lot of people there will also be fighting for survival. We see also that the gap between rich and poor is further widening, so this is definitely something that we have to tackle, and this needs to be discussed, the social disparity here at the WEF in Davos as well. We need to realize that there is enough food. Food security has been such a big topic during the pandemic for everyone. There are enough resources for everyone, but we need to equally divide them between people. As you mentioned, I traveled to quite a lot of countries over the past 3 years. Despite COVID, I can luckily call myself a novid or a COVID virgin. I've never caught it so far. There are people with certain blood types or genetic dispositions, I guess, who never catch it. And I was able to travel to countries from Djibouti to Rwanda to Azerbaijan, UK and Canada and the US and many other places, and really witnessed how people are struggling in their daily life. So the struggle is real, Michael.
Yeah, you mentioned food security. It was really striking to me the other day. I was reading about a number from the Food and Agriculture Organization, and it really amazed me that we still have around 2 billion people of our fellow mankind that face moderate to severe food insecurity. We've seen food prices ease recently, but nonetheless, we still have a food crisis on our hands. So hopefully the more vulnerable groups in our international community can get help as soon as possible. Martina, I also want to get your reflections on another recent conversation that you've had, and this time with the World Travel and Tourism President and CEO Julia Simpson. What was her take on the rebound in global travel for 2023, and especially as we see China adjusting its COVID-19 policies, the return of Chinese tourists to many parts of the world?
She was extremely delighted about the reopening of China and the end of the zero-COVID policy. She's super optimistic and bullish about the increase of travelers from China, that she expects actually an exponential growth in Chinese visitors to other parts of the world. She mentioned some of the top destinations are the Indian Ocean, are the US, are the UK as well, Paris, London, New York for shopping, but also Dubai and of course Australia and New Zealand. She also mentioned that 1 in 10 jobs and 1 in 10 US dollars are generated from international travel and tourism. So this is extremely an important industry. She also said that in 2019, 253 billion US dollars were generated and added to the global economy thanks to Chinese tourists. This is about 15% of the total. Now, I also read some interesting statistics by the WTTC, where they said that about 63% of people around the world in a survey, participants said that they want to travel again this year. And this, of course, comes on the back of the United Nations World Travel Organization, which expects that by the end of last year, about 65% of the pre-COVID level of tourism has been able to reach again the pre-pandemic levels. So it's a good sign for tourism, and I hope that a lot of Chinese travelers will, of course, come back to Switzerland as well during the Year of the Rabbit.
Yeah, absolutely, Martina. Martina, finally, I want to ask you about climate change, which is, like you mentioned, a huge topic at this year's annual meeting. I counted 36 sessions using my filter function on the World Economic Forum's website, but probably there's
Michael,
even more.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, Martina, I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me? Well, it seems like let's try one more time to see if we can connect with Martina Fuchs in Davos. Martina, line check 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Martina? It seems like Martina can't hear us. Unfortunately, I wanted to ask her about climate change because Martina is witnessing firsthand the impacts of climate change in her native Switzerland, but perhaps we'll save that conversation for another day. That was Martina Fuchs, international TV anchor and business journalist. Our next guest is from China Merchants Port, whose parent company, China Merchants Group, is one of the country's most storied companies. China Merchants Group was at the forefront of China's industrialization process back in the late 19th century. Now, with over 150 years of history, the industry heavyweight that is CMG has big operations today in transportation, in finance, and property. So, when we come back, we'll speak to Jonathan Chow, officer at China Merchants Port, for more on the Chinese economy. Stay tuned.
.360-degree profiles of industry movers and shakers, tech mavericks, and policymakers. We drill down on their success. We ask how they set strategy and how they navigate in an increasingly competitive market. Real talk, real business. Join the conversation. Biz Talk, only on CGTN.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to our virtual Davos studio here in Beijing. Well, China Merchants Port is China's largest public port developer, investor, and operator. CM Port's investments span the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, and overseas, with a port network portfolio that covers over 40 ports in 25 countries and regions around the world. Jonathan Chow, an officer at CM Port, joins us now with a look at the Chinese economy. Jonathan, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Michael. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again as well, Jonathan. Jonathan, you represent China Merchants Port, but like we mentioned earlier, your parent company is China Merchants Group. And China Merchants Group, you're in shipping, you're in logistics, transportation, finance, real estate, and you manage a pilot free trade zone in China's Guangdong province as well. So I think you have a lot of visibility in terms of where activity stands for the Chinese economy. So give our viewers a sense of how the recovery in China's economy is ticking along, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Michael. Well, due to the Ukraine crisis, as you know, it has supercharged energy and commodity prices and particularly boosted some inflation. Furthermore, due to the aftermath of the pandemic, it interferes and also causes some kind of obstacles towards the economic recovery process. Therefore, I suspect the global economic growth will slow down for a bit. And meanwhile, various economies are facing different levels of inflation, as well as potential crisis in energy, food, and debt, so which have increased uncertainty in the global economy. However, in 2023, China will continue to carry out new development concept, speed up in establishing new development pattern, promote high-quality development in order to stabilize the employment and inflation rate. And meanwhile, to expand effective demand, boost the driving force of reform, and to consolidate the foundation of economic recovery and development. So therefore, in 2023, the China Merchant Group will continue to thoroughly implement the concept of high-quality development, focus on endogenous growth, focus on promoting and upgrading our innovation, and by embarking into a new journey of development, we will focus on areas like digitalization, marketization, internationalization, platformization, and also to continue to invest in smart ports. So in order to achieve our strategic goal of being a high-quality, world-class, comprehensive port service provider. So we are very optimistic, and we will look forward to 2023.
Well, Jonathan, you're joining us right now from Hong Kong. And as we know, Hong Kong has now reopened its borders, both the Chinese mainland as well as with the rest of the world. So make a pitch for Hong Kong then, Jonathan. What is the business and investment sentiment like right now in China's special administrative region?
So with the resumption of the normal exchanges between Hong Kong and China mainland, I believe it will definitely stimulate Hong Kong post-pandemic economic recovery and inject new impetus into the development of various industries, especially the catering industry, wholesale, retail industry, shipping and transportation industry. The development of innovation and technology and the connection with cities in the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area, and the acceleration of integration into the overall development of the country are of great help. So there is a data that I would like to share with you, Michael. So according to the Hong Kong Trade Development Council, after the announcement of the reopening of the border, there are nearly 2,000 representatives of enterprises from Guangdong province intended to come to Hong Kong to participate in 3 exhibitions, which already took place last week in the Wan Chai Convention Center. So the Department of so what I'm trying to say is that our economy in Hong Kong after the open of the borders is going to be very robust in the coming future. And also after the implementation of the national security law, Hong Kong economic vibrancy has continuously been recovering, and the status of international financial, trade, and shipping center have been strengthened. So Hong Kong people, along with the global capital, have regained confidence towards Hong Kong market, and Hong Kong Hong Kong as a global financial center will stay very, very robust.
Yeah, well, you mentioned you're expecting a lot more visitors from Guangdong province to Hong Kong. Just a quick note for our viewers. I mean, the West Kowloon station in Hong Kong is now reopened with the Chinese mainland. And I was taking a look at the train rides. I mean, the high-speed rail is amazing. The fastest train ride will get you from Guangzhou to West Kowloon station in just 43 minutes. The high-speed rail between Beijing and Hong Kong, that will reopen sometime, I guess, at a future date soon, I'm assuming. But that would also be quite a unique experience, going from China's north to China's south and enjoying all the scenery along the way. So we'll see. Hopefully, I might take a high-speed train one day from Beijing to Hong Kong as well. Jonathan, I want to ask you about the confidence of the Chinese economy that you may have for 2023, because we are entering sort of a gloomy macro backdrop for 2023. The IMF is expecting the world to slow down this year to about 2.7% growth, and perhaps even lower at that, as a lot of indicators are pointing to even slower growth compared to 2.7%. But we are expecting a recovery here in China, and a more robust recovery at that as well. So how confident are you about the Chinese economy in 2023 and beyond?
Well, in 2023, China will tackle growth challenges with its dual circulation development paradigm. While external circulation, like foreign trade, will deepen regional and international trade and investment ties, internal circulation will seek to accelerate domestic demand. Now that most of the COVID-19 restrictions have been lifted, the government will implement a variety of measures to boost consumption. The idea is to increase the incomes of urban and rural residents so they can help boost the housing sector, rise new energy vehicle sales, and improve elder care. So meanwhile, China will actually, with my understanding, the Chinese government is already on the move at a national conference held last week, which Minister of Finance mentioned that the efforts to leverage the proactive fiscal policy in a more direct and effective manner, fine-tune supportive policy for enterprises, and boost confidence of the market. So as I said in the beginning, once China boosts the driving force of reform and to consolidate the foundation of economic recovery and development, I'm sure our Chinese economy will be extremely robust in the coming year. So I'm looking so much forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese economy may experience economic headwinds here and there, but the scale of the Chinese economy is absolutely massive. We were talking about the consumption potential down the road of having an 800 million plus strong middle income group. So a lot of opportunities ahead for businesses all around the world in the China market. Jonathan, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights and perspectives on this today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
And that was Jonathan Chow, officer at China Merchants of Port. And our thanks also to Sir Martin Sorrell, Sean Doherty of the World Economic Forum, and business journalist Martina Fuchs for sharing their perspectives with us on a number of key topics that will be discussed at this year's World Economic Forum annual meeting. And of course, here on CGTN Global Business, we will be bringing you a series of our conversations with participants at Davos all week, including from a number of China's largest companies. So indeed, stay tuned for that. Thanks for joining us on this edition of Looking Ahead here on CGTN. I'm Michael Wang here in Beijing. We will see you again next time.